Jesus was not the only Messiah in the ancient world. There were many. Most were forgotten. Because when their leader died, their movement died with them. But Christianity didn't. And historically speaking, it probably should have. So why are we still talking about Jesus 2,000 years later? In the first century, Judea was full of tension. The Jewish people lived under Roman occupation. Many hoped God would send a deliverer, a king, a Messiah who would defeat Israel's enemies and restore the kingdom. And because of that hope, different revolutionary leaders appeared throughout history claiming authority, power, or divine calling. We know names like Judas the Galilean, Theudas, and Simon Bar Kokhba. Most people today have never heard of them. Why? Because when those leaders died, their movements died too. That's how messianic movements worked in the ancient world. If the leader failed, the movement collapsed, especially if Rome executed him publicly. And then came Jesus. But crucifixion was not just execution. It was humiliation, shame, disgrace. The Romans used crucifixion to publicly crush enemies and send a message: this person has been defeated. Historian Martin Hengel called crucifixion the most cruel and shameful punishment. And to the Jewish world, it was even worse. Deuteronomy says, "Anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse." So think about this historically. The Messiah was supposed to defeat Israel's enemies. Instead, Jesus was arrested, mocked, beaten, and crucified publicly by Rome. From the outside, this looked like total failure. Which raises a serious historical question. Why would anyone invent this story? If you were making up a religion in the first century, a crucified Messiah is almost the last thing you would create. It sounded absurd. In fact, Paul admits this openly. In 1 Corinthians 1:23, he writes, "We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." That's not how legends are normally invented. Legends usually make their heroes look victorious. Christianity centered itself on what looked like defeat. Why? And it gets even stranger. Because the disciples themselves were not expecting resurrection. Modern audiences often miss this. Jewish belief at the time was generally a resurrection at the end of history, not one man rising in the middle of history while the rest of the world continued normally. Even Jesus' own followers seemed devastated by the crucifixion. After Jesus died, the disciples scattered. Peter denied knowing him. The movement appeared broken. In Luke 24, two followers describe Jesus by saying, "We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." Past tense. We had hoped. That sounds like disappointment, not expectation. Historically speaking, these do not look like people preparing to invent a resurrection story. They look like people whose world collapsed. And yet, something changed. Only weeks later, these same followers are publicly proclaiming in Jerusalem that Jesus had risen from the dead, the very city where he had been executed. And they preached this message despite persecution, imprisonment, and suffering. Now let's be careful here. The claim is not, people died for Christianity, therefore Christianity is automatically true. People from many religions have died for beliefs, but people rarely suffer for something they know they invented. That's why the disciples matter historically. At minimum, the evidence strongly suggests they sincerely believed something extraordinary had happened. Even skeptical historian Bart D. Ehrman acknowledges the disciples genuinely believed they saw the risen Jesus. Now, that does not prove Christianity by itself, but it creates another question. What explains the transformation? Because again, historically, Christianity should have died at the cross. And yet, it didn't. Instead, it spread across the Roman Empire, not through military conquest, not through political power, but through the message of a crucified and risen Messiah. And that message spread despite persecution, imprisonment, rejection, and execution. Within a few centuries, the faith that should have disappeared became one of the most influential movements in human history. So we come back to the question, why? Why did every other failed messianic movement fade into history while Christianity survived? And what's fascinating is that even Islam preserves part of this mystery. The Quran repeatedly calls Jesus Al-Masih, the Messiah. For example, Surah Al-Imran says, "His name will be the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary." But historically, Messiah was never just a casual religious title. It referred to God's anointed king, the promised ruler, the one connected to God's kingdom and redemption. Yet in Islam, Jesus is primarily presented as a prophet, while many of the historic meanings associated with messiahship are removed or redefined. The crucifixion is denied, the atonement is rejected, and yet the title remains. That raises an interesting historical question. Why preserve the title Messiah if the core events that gave the title its significance are no longer there? The earliest Christians gave one answer consistently. They believed Jesus rose from the dead. Now, you may or may not accept that explanation, but historically, you still have to explain the movement. You still have to explain the rise of Christianity, the transformation of the disciples, the centrality of the crucifixion, and why a message that sounded foolish to the ancient world somehow conquered the Roman Empire. That is the historical problem of Jesus. And 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him. Check the evidence. Read it in context. Then decide. If you're ready to learn, grow, and speak truth in love, join us, subscribe now. The conversation starts here.